This deep dive into Conversion Bible, by the way, is powered by Growth Suite.
Oh, cool.
Growth Suite helps you to run smart discount campaigns on your Shopify store. You can test it for free on your Shopify store.
Yeah.
Just land on the Shopify App Store now and test it for free.
Sweet.
All right, so today we're diving deep into A/D testing.
Okay, yeah.
Which is super critical for anyone who's running a Shopify store.
Right.
And you want to see those, sales numbers climb.
Yeah.
We've been digging through Conversion Bible.
Okay.
And we've uncovered some key insights that are going to help you, the listener, stop wasting time on tests that just don't work.
Right.
We're talking about getting really laser focused on what really matters to your customers.
Absolutely. I think it's it's pretty common for people to jump into A/B testing only to find that their efforts are kind of producing, barely a ripple.
Right.
Conversion Bible highlights this pretty sobering statistic that only about 12.5% of A/B tests actually end up yielding significant results.
Wow.
And over half of first-time testers are just left disappointed.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's not what, a lot of people expect.
Right.
So that really underscores why, why understanding those common, slip-ups, those mistakes is so essential for you.
Exactly. As Conversion Bible points out, it's not some kind of magic bullet.
Right.
But when you approach it strategically, it can be a real game changer.
Absolutely.
So for anyone who's new to A/B testing, at its heart, it's like bringing the scientific method to your online store.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
You're essentially running a controlled experiment where you show two different versions, slightly different versions, of something on your website to your visitors.
Right.
And see which one performs better.
Yeah.
And this could be anything. It could be, the words you use on your call to action buttons. It could be the images you showcase. It could be the entire layout of your product page.
Totally, yeah.
It could even be like the checkout process someone goes through to buy something.
Yeah.
So, anything you can think of, you can probably A/B test.
That's right. And what's really interesting is, in today's online world, A/B testing isn't just, a nice to have.
Yeah.
It's really becoming, absolutely fundamental to success. Conversion Bible touches on this, talking about how digital advertising is changing.
Yeah.
So, we've got things like Apple's app tracking transparency.
Right.
And Google's phasing out third-party cookies. These traditional methods of attracting new customers are not as effective as they once were.
Right.
And that makes maximizing the value of the traffic that you're already getting, to your store all the more important.
Absolutely. Those rising costs of acquiring customers and the shrinking returns on ad spending, really drive that point home.
Yeah.
So instead of just pouring more money into getting people to your store, the smarter move is to optimize what happens once they get there.
Exactly. Conversion Bible gives this really good example.
Okay.
Where they say, if you boost your conversion rate from, let's say, 2% to 3%, that's a 50% increase in sales.
Wow. Yeah, that's huge.
From the exact same number of visitors.
Right.
So really optimizing that experience to make sure that you're squeezing as much value as you can out of that traffic.
And let's not forget, it costs something like 5 to 25 times more to get a new customer than to keep an existing one happy.
That's right, yeah.
So,
and I think Conversion Bible also mentions that, companies that have a really strong testing culture, they see up to 30% better growth than their competitors.
That's massive.
Yeah, it's a big difference.
So, effective A/B testing allows you to tackle what Conversion Bible calls, the leaky bucket issue. On your store.
Yeah.
So these are all the points where potential customers are dropping off before they complete a purchase.
Yeah.
And by, systematically testing and refining these areas, you're plugging those leaks.
You're patching them up.
And making the most of every single visitor you get.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's get into mistake number 1.
Okay.
That Conversion Bible highlights, and that is testing the wrong elements.
Right.
So, we've all seen those debates online about whether, a button should be green or blue. Or, things like that.
Right.
But the truth is, tweaking those really minor design elements often doesn't lead to a significant change.
Yeah, you're not going to see a massive, overnight difference.
Right.
By changing, button colors.
Right.
Or, little tiny design tweaks.
The core insight here is to focus on the moments of truth in your customer journey.
Yeah.
The points where they actually make a decision to proceed or to abandon the process.
To either buy something or to leave.
Right.
And Conversion Bible makes this really important distinction between what they call low-impact tests and high-impact tests.
Got it.
So those low-impact tests are things like fiddling with button colors, as long as there's already enough contrast.
Right.
Making small text changes, but not really altering the main message.
Yeah.
Tiny little layout adjustments, but nothing that actually affects, how visible the key information is.
Right.
All those little tiny things tend to produce results that are just statistically insignificant.
Got it.
Like you're trying to adjust the course of a huge ocean liner by turning a little tiny knob.
I like that.
I'm
not going to do much.
Not a lot of impact. But high-impact tests, these are the ones that really target those fundamental drivers behind a customer's decision.
Yeah.
So things like, your core value proposition, like how clearly and persuasively you communicate the benefits of what you're selling, things like product imagery, which can absolutely make or break a sale.
Right.
The copy that you use in your call to action buttons.
Yeah.
Not just the color, but what those buttons actually say, how you present your pricing, any discounts you offer, the overall structure of your product page, and any friction points in the checkout process, those can all have massive influence.
Yeah, those are the big ones.
Those are the ones that really matter.
Okay.
And, Conversion Bible has some really good advice on, how you can pinpoint these high impact areas.
Right.
And it all comes down to data.
Right.
So, where are customers spending most of their time on your site? Where are they abandoning their carts?
Yeah.
Or leaving pages most often?
Right.
What questions keep popping up in customer service inquiries?
Yeah.
What objections are people raising before they buy?
Yeah, those are great points.
Those are the breadcrumbs that can lead you to the areas where you can really get the most impactful results from your testing.
Absolutely. Conversion Bible also introduces a couple of really useful frameworks for prioritizing tests.
Right.
So things like, the PIE method, which is potential, importance, ease.
Yeah.
And then there's the IC score, which is impact, confidence, ease.
Yeah.
And these give you a way to figure out which test to tackle first.
That's right. Yeah.
Focusing on the ones that have the biggest potential upside, but are also relatively straightforward to implement.
So if you're thinking about PIE, think about the potential improvement that you could see.
Yeah.
How important that area is to your overall goals and how easy it is to test.
Got it.
And ICE is very similar. You're thinking about the estimated impact of that change.
Okay.
How confident you are in that estimate.
Right.
And then again, the ease of implementation.
I like it, yeah. That makes sense.
Super straightforward frameworks.
Yeah.
But really helpful for deciding where to start.
Absolutely. So the key takeaway here is that if you're aiming for big gains in your conversion rate, you need to direct your testing efforts towards the elements that really sway your customers' decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Those minor tweaks, they might give you a tiny little lift at best, but testing your core value proposition or smoothing out those checkout bumps, those are the things that can lead to some big breakthroughs.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on to the second mistake that Conversion Bible highlights.
Okay.
Which is not having a clear hypothesis.
Right.
And this really resonated with me.
Yeah.
Because it's like, you have an idea to change something, but you don't have a really good reason why you think it'll work.
All right.
Or what specific outcome you're expecting.
So a strong hypothesis is not just a guess.
Right.
You're not just throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Yeah.
A strong hypothesis is like a mini experiment proposal.
Right.
It forces you to really think critically about cause and effect. And, Conversion Bible uses a good analogy here.
Okay.
It's like setting off on a road trip without a destination.
Yeah.
You might drive around for a while.
Yeah.
But you're probably not going to end up anywhere in particular.
Right.
And that's what happens with your testing when you don't have a clear hypothesis.
It's aimless. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Conversion Bible breaks down a strong hypothesis into 3 key ingredients.
Right.
First, there's an observation. So, something you've noticed in your data.
Yeah.
Or how customers are behaving.
Right.
Second, there's your proposed solution.
Yep.
So that's the very specific change you're going to test.
Okay.
to address that observation.
Right.
And third, there's your expected outcome.
Yeah.
So that's a measurable result
Right.
that you predict will happen.
Yeah.
And, I think the contrast Conversion Bible draws between a weak and a strong hypothesis is really helpful.
Yeah.
A weak one might be something as vague as, changing the add to cart button to red
Right.
will increase sales.
Yeah, yeah.
But a strong hypothesis is much more detailed.
Okay.
And it's grounded in data.
Right.
For example, it might be something like, based on our heat map data, showing that customers rarely scroll below the fold on mobile,
Okay.
moving the add to cart button higher on the page will increase the add to cart rate by at least 15% for mobile users
Okay.
because it'll be more visible without scrolling.
Yeah.
So there you have it.
Yeah.
Strong hypothesis, very specific and data-backed.
That's right. It lays it all out.
It does, yeah. So, it includes the why. So that rationale, based on the heat map data,
Right.
it specifies the who, so that's mobile users.
Yeah.
And it includes the what, which is a measurable increase in the add to cart rate.
Yeah, that's a great point. So it's really about being very specific
Right.
with what you're testing.
And Conversion Bible even gives you a handy template
Oh, nice.
for crafting these.
Okay.
If we make this change,
Yeah.
then this will happen because of this reason.
I like it. Yeah. Simple but effective.
Exactly. So, formulating a clear hypothesis isn't just about setting up the test correctly.
Right.
It's also about creating a learning opportunity,
Yeah, that's a good point.
regardless of how the test turns out. Because even if your prediction is wrong,
Yeah.
a well-defined hypothesis will allow you to analyze why it was wrong,
Right.
giving you valuable insights into customer behavior and preferences.
Yeah. And Conversion Bible also points out that there are all kinds of different data sources that you can use to form these hypotheses.
Okay.
So, you've got things like your website analytics showing you where people are dropping off. You could use customer surveys
Right.
to uncover pain points.
Yeah, it's great.
Even things like user testing, customer service inquiries, competitive analysis,
Yeah.
there are a lot of sources out there that can give you those initial ideas.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's move on to the third common mistake
Okay.
that Conversion Bible points out.
Mm-hmm.
And that is testing too many variables at the same time.
Right.
And I can definitely see the temptation here.
Yeah.
You want to see results quickly.
Yeah.
So why not tweak a bunch of things at once?
That's right.
Right.
Well, Conversion Bible is really clear that this approach makes it pretty much impossible to tell which change caused the result.
Right.
So imagine you're, overhauling a product page. Yeah.
And you add customer reviews.
Okay.
You swap out the product images.
Yeah.
You rewrite the description. You rearrange the whole layout.
Right.
And you do all of that at once.
Yeah.
Well, if that new version performs better,
Yeah.
you don't know if it was the reviews, the images, the description, the layout,
Yeah.
or maybe a combination of all of those.
Right.
You have no idea.
That's a really good point.
You just know that, okay, something worked,
Yeah.
but you don't know what it was.
And even worse, what if some of those changes had a positive impact
Right.
and some had a negative impact?
Right.
And they just kind of canceled each other out.
That's right.
Yeah.
You might think that nothing you did had any effect,
Right.
when in reality, some of those changes might have been really powerful on their own.
Yeah.
So Conversion Bible's emphasis here is on isolating variables.
Okay.
So they recommend testing one significant change at a time,
Yeah.
keeping everything else consistent.
Right. Between that original version and the version you're testing.
Yeah.
And they also recommend, running these sequential tests
Okay.
where you test one change, you analyze the results,
Yeah.
and then, you use what you've learned
Right.
to design the next test.
Okay.
And that gives you much clearer insights.
Right. Because if you change 5 things at once and something gets better,
Yeah.
you have no idea which of those 5 things.
You have no idea was the one. Yeah.
Right. And Conversion Bible does mention multivariate testing,
Okay.
where you test multiple variations of different elements
Okay.
all at the same time.
Yeah.
But they say, for most Shopify stores,
Yeah.
especially those that don't have, massive amounts of traffic,
Right.
sticking to testing one variable at a time
Yeah.
is usually more effective
Okay.
because it gives you those clearer, actionable results.
Makes sense.
And they also talk about A/B testing.
as another option when you do need to test a few different approaches.
Okay.
So instead of just testing an A and a B,
Yeah.
you've got an A, a B, a C, a D.
Got it.
And so that lets you pinpoint
Yeah.
which specific change had the biggest impact.
I like it. Okay, so the big takeaway there is to isolate the effect of individual changes,
Right.
to really build a reliable understanding
Yeah.
of what resonates with your audience.
Absolutely. When you test one variable at a time,
Yeah.
you get this, clear cause and effect insight
Right.
that you can actually build on.
Right, and use that going forward.
That's right. Yeah.
All right, mistake number 4.
Okay.
According to Conversion, Bible is having insufficient sample size.
Right.
And this is something I think a lot of people might not pay enough attention to.
Yeah. Especially when you're eager to see those results.
Right.
It's easy to get impatient and want to call it early.
Yeah.
But, Conversion Bible gives this really good explanation using the coin flip analogy.
Okay.
If you flip a coin, just a handful of times, you might get a streak of heads or tails purely by chance.
Right.
That doesn't actually mean the coin is biased.
Yeah.
Similarly, with A/B testing, if you don't have enough visitors exposed to each version of your test,
Right.
the early results that you see might just be random. It might just be luck.
Right.
Rather than a real difference in performance.
And that can lead to what are called false positives.
Right.
Where you mistakenly think a change is beneficial when it's not.
Yeah.
Or even worse, false negatives, where you miss out on a really good change.
Right.
Because the data didn't look significant.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's all due to just a small sample size.
Right.
Eh,
And, Conversion Bible highlights a few key things that determine how many visitors you really need for your test to be meaningful.
Okay.
So, things like your current conversion rate, what percentage of your visitors are currently taking that action,
Yeah.
the minimum improvement you're hoping to see,
Right.
and the level of statistical confidence that you want to have in your results.
Okay. Yeah.
So, typically you're aiming for 95% confidence.
Right.
That you're seeing a real difference and not just,
Randomness.
random chance.
Yeah.
And of course, the total amount of traffic that your website gets is also a huge factor.
And they give a good example.
Yeah.
If your current conversion rate is 2%,
Okay.
and you want to be able to detect a 20% improvement with 95% confidence, you'll need something like 25,000 visitors
Wow.
to each version of your test.
Okay.
Which shows why, testing tiny tweaks
Right?
or expecting small improvements can be really impractical for stores that don't have a lot of traffic.
Yeah. You might just not get enough data
Right.
within a reasonable time frame
To really make a good decision.
to really trust those findings.
Right.
And, Conversion Bible stresses the importance of using a sample size calculator.
Okay.
That's specifically designed for A/B testing.
Right.
A lot of A/B testing platforms actually have these built in.
Yeah, that's true.
And you can also find, free calculators online.
Yeah.
But they can really help you figure out how many visitors you need.
Based on
Yeah.
those specific test parameters.
That's right.
And the key takeaway here is that making a decision based on data from too few visitors
Yeah.
can actually be more damaging than not making a decision at all.
Right. You can actually end up going down the wrong path.
Yeah. So make sure you have enough traffic.
Absolutely.
Right.
So really what it comes down to is making sure you have enough visitors
Yeah.
to see your test variations
Right.
so that your results are statistically reliable and that you can be reasonably sure
Yeah.
that any differences that you see
Yep.
between those versions are actually due to the changes that you made and not just, random luck.
Absolutely. Okay.
Yeah.
So mistake number 5, improper test duration.
Right.
So we talked about needing enough people to see your test.
Mm-hmm.
But Conversion Bible also emphasizes that the amount of time that you run your test for is just as important.
Yeah, it's not just about the number of people. It's also about how long you run that test.
Exactly. So a common question, as Conversion Bible points out, is whether you could just stop a test as soon as it hits that statistical significance.
Right.
And the answer,
Yeah.
unfortunately, isn't always a simple yes.
Yeah, it's tempting to want to end it early, but
Yeah.
it can be misleading.
Right.
And Conversion Bible lists a few reasons why.
Okay.
So, first of all, think about how customer behavior changes depending on the day of the week.
Yeah, that's true.
So, maybe your sales always spike on the weekends,
Right.
things like that.
Yeah.
You also have variations depending on the time of day.
Mm-hmm.
People are browsing. Sometimes there's this temporary novelty effect.
Right.
where a new design just gets a short-term boost
Mm-hmm.
because it's different.
Right, yeah.
People are curious. They
Yeah.
want to check it out.
Yeah.
And, early data,
Yeah.
it can sometimes just be skewed
Mm-hmm.
by some random outliers.
Right.
So ending it too early,
Yeah.
you might not be getting the full picture.
Right. Yeah.
And then Conversion Bible also says that, on the flip side, letting tests run for too long,
Yeah.
that can also be problematic.
Right.
So you could be delaying the rollout of a winning version.
Yeah.
If you already have enough data,
Yeah.
you could be wasting resources on a test that's already giving you a clear answer.
Yeah.
And if you're running a test for a really long time,
Yeah.
there's more opportunity for those external factors to creep in,
Right.
like seasonal changes or promotions you're running.
Right.
That could really mess with your data. Okay. So you need to be careful about that as well.
So, what's the sweet spot?
Well, Conversion Bible suggests that you should aim for, a minimum of 1 to 2 full business cycles.
Okay.
So, for a lot of businesses, that's 1 to 2 weeks.
Right.
That includes your weekend, your weekday variations.
Right.
You want to make sure you've hit statistical significance
Mm.
and ideally have at least 100 to 200 conversions per variation.
Got it.
Just to make sure you have enough data to be
Right.
really confident.
Okay, so you're looking for, 1 to 2 weeks, statistical significance,
Yeah.
and at least 100 to 200 conversions
Right.
per variation.
Yeah, that's a good rule of thumb.
Okay, so Conversion Bible also lists some key signals that a test might be ready to conclude.
Okay.
So, hitting that 95% statistical significance level,
Mhm.
having that sufficient sample size,